Good afternoon, Tony Dubiel here with video 6, demo 4. Today we're going to talk about Cisco Intercloud Fabric Director and its ability to use the REST APIs. Essentially, we will configure many of the same tasks that we completed in the previous labs and demos. However, this time we will only leverage the APIs and some of the free tool sets that allow us to use the APIs versus the GUI interface as part of the admin console. First, I wanted to share with you the guide. This is the current guide for the current version of Intercloud Fabric Business Edition 2.2.1. I'll leave this link in the comments along with this video so that you can download it as a reference. Basically, the current state of APIs in Intercloud Fabric Director is partial functionality. However, as you can see, there's quite a bit of functionality that's included in the REST APIs. Moving into the next release of software in Diablo, we will have full functionality and feature parity with all of the configuration options that you find in the GUI admin console. You would be able to leverage the API as an alternative way of provisioning these parameters. What you find today is these operations available as northbound APIs. So what is a northbound API? This allows you to either use a scripting tool like Python or curl, or Postman in the case of using your browser, your Chrome browser, and then there's a REST client available for Firefox as well. You can use any of those methods for configuring parameters based on APIs and API calls to collect information that perhaps you would share northbound to another application. As we can see here, we have administrative functions for the network, for users, adding users, deleting users, creating catalogs and adding items to catalogs. If you recall, a catalog is where we provide the ability for end users to have access to templates to spin up new virtual machines that have pre-installed guest operating systems and applications out in the cloud in AWS or another provider cloud as an example. We also have service request operations where we can see the status of any of the tasks that we implement based on leveraging the Intercloud Fabric Director and the service request ID that is associated with a particular task from a workflow. We also have various virtual data center operations and virtual machine operations, migrating virtual machines as an example, or spinning up a new virtual machine, or powering a virtual machine on or off, or terminating a virtual machine so that we no longer accrue usage fees from AWS or Azure or one of the other provider clouds. When we're not using a virtual machine, we can decommission that virtual machine. So we'll run through some of these tasks using the Postman utility as part of Chrome, and we'll also take a look at curl as another example of a command line scripting tool that's a part of a Mac, and PowerShell can be used. Similarly, if you are a Windows PC user, this is the curl interface here, and we'll talk through what all of this syntax means. But for now, let's go ahead. We will obtain our key by using a valid user account with privileges. So we'll go ahead and enter that URL to obtain a password. As you can see, this is a user account and a password. This lab is not online, so if you were excited that you'll hack into this thing, that's not going to happen. And I'm changing the password anyway, just in case. All right, so we'll send this request, and then the response back. And if you're not familiar with how the application responds using an API, everything is HTTP or HTTPS based for security. It's essentially web client and server communications. So you'll see gets and post and so on if we were to look at this in a Wireshark. Um, and essentially, the application responded with a valid key. So we'll need this key for later as we proceed to configure items in the Intercloud Fabric director. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to add that header. That way we don't have to type this key in every time we attempt to configure an item. We will keep it in the browser. So what we'll do is we'll go to headers. This is the name of the key. Remove any extra spaces or you'll have issues. And then here's the key. So we got that key in there, there's no extra space. All right, so we'll go ahead and proceed on. So we'll delete that URL. Okay, so the first thing we want to understand is the configurations for cloud and virtual data centers and virtual machines that have been previously configured by the GUI. At this point, we're not using the GUI, so we need to understand some of the naming conventions so that way we can set parameters as we proceed forward. So the first thing we're going to do is understand the configured clouds. And by cloud, I mean a connection to a provider cloud, such as AWS or Azure. Okay, this is JSON format, which is a little bit easier for me to read than XML. So this is what we're seeing here. We have Intercloud Fabric name, AWS Cloud. It has an ID that we may need to use as a parameter in future API calls. And then we also have our Azure Cloud right here. And we can see much of the same data that is available and visible from the GUI, such as the IP addressing of the tunnel, the Intercloud extender, the ICS switch that's running on the provider cloud side. We can see the IP addresses that terminate that tunnel, and we can see that the tunnel is operational. So much of the same status information that we can see from the GUI is available to us in an API call that we can share with another application or parse through this as part of collecting a script. Now in XML format, it's a little bit different, a little bit harder for me to digest, so I prefer JSON. Now I mentioned that we could also use curl. Curl gives us an option for XML and JSON format, but for me it's a little bit hard to read in either case. So here is a request to see my login profile. I'm currently logged in as the admin. First name, I just put admin first, admin last, an email address that was included in the system for notifications, and my role as admin. So this is what the output looks like from a curl script. However, for the remainder of the demo, I'm preferring to use this tool, the Postman, because it's a little bit easier to read and it's easier to see on my screen as well. Okay, so now that we know what the cloud naming convention is and the available clouds that we have provisioned in the system in terms of AWS and Azure in our case, we can go ahead and view additional configurations, and then ultimately we'll configure and change some of these virtual machines that are in the system. The next thing that we want to understand are the logical data centers that we configured previously and how we've logically partitioned resources and policies in the system. So we'll take a look at the virtual data centers that have been configured in previous labs. All right, so now what we're going to do is get all the VDCs. Again, JSON format. And we can see that we have a VDC named AWS App for application servers. This is a part of the AWS Cloud. We also have a dev test VDC in the AWS Cloud. We have an AWS load balancer VDC. We have an AWS web server VDC. And then we configured VDCs in Azure Cloud. So we have a dev test environment. And just to point out, this dev test is actually interconnected to the dev test in AWS, which is one of my use cases for cloud-to-cloud connectivity. We also have Azure Q&A. And we have a default group, which is configured by default, all of the virtual machines as they originally existed in vCenter. Originally, as you bring them into the system, they're part of a default group. And then we can configure additional groups to use for migrating virtual machines from the cloud back to the data center to keep them separated, logically separated. For policy purposes and so on, we've created additional VDCs. So I have a private application VDC, a private dev test VDC, a private web VDC. Okay, so those are my clouds, those are my virtual data centers. Now I would like to see the virtual machines that are configured. Much of the configuration is the same. This is the IP address of the Intercloud Fabric Director. This is the URL that we would create to make an API call. So this is always the same for every REST API call. And then we have an operational name, which is the variable of the function that we are calling in this API. And then additionally, as we configure or make changes, we have additional parameters. So we'll walk through the syntax of how we add parameters in order to make a change or to add something new. But for just viewing information, we typically only have the operational name, and then we're pulling in data. In the case of granularity, we can call a specific item based off of an ID number. So we can add that parameter as well. And we'll see some examples that show that. For example, we might have the need to look at a specific virtual data center. So 11 would represent this AWS app VDC. But in a parameter, we could call it specifically. If we wanted to see specific information on that VDC, we would use its VDC ID 11 as part of a parameter variable. All right, so now that we've seen the VDCs, let's look at the virtual machines. All right, so this is all my virtual machines. Once we know the virtual machine IDs, we can call on a specific virtual machine, similar to the VDCs and the clouds as well. Everything can be specific or general. Okay, so as I alluded to, we have a virtual machine ID. So this is the label specifically to a virtual machine. Every instance as it exists either in the vCenter, which is the on-premise data center, we have an inventory. We can see the IP address, we can see if it's powered on, we can see the virtual data center that it belongs to, we can see if the tunnel status is configured. Which is more important in the provider cloud side of this because those connections are encrypted. So we'll scroll down. These are all vCenters. So here's one in the cloud. This is a LAMP stack. That's a part of dev test in Amazon. We can see the public IP address. We can see the enterprise IP address, which is that encrypted IP as part of that client VNIC. We can see that it's powered on, the tunnel status is up. We can see the guest operating system in version. So we have quite a bit of information that we can abstract from these API calls. All right, so I'm looking for a specific virtual machine here, my load balancer. Okay. So here is my load balancer, which is VMID 26. So we'll pick on this virtual machine. We'll turn it off and on, and we'll see the status of this specific virtual machine. Then we'll go ahead and we'll we'll instantiate a net new virtual machine as well as part of the catalog. Okay, so the identifier is 26, so we'll need that variable. We can see here the op name Intercloud, user API VM power off. So we'll power this VM off because it's actually on at this point in time. And the parameter again is 26 because that is the VM ID for that specific virtual machine. And as I mentioned earlier, we are authenticated because I have this key embedded into the header. Okay, so we have a response, and we've sent Intercloud user power off. A result of 0 means that it is in process. So that is happening as we speak. And just to give you some perspective here, we'll jump into the GUI momentarily. We'll go into compute. We'll go into the VMs. We'll find that load balancer, which is right here, and we can see that it's powering off. So it's in process of powering down. If you want to see it in AWS, go ahead and take a look at that real quick. And we can see that it is now stopped. So we remotely configured both our Intercloud Fabric director, and then that API was passed on to AWS without needing to go to the portal. We accomplished that from an API call. There it is. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and list my available virtual machines just to validate that it's powered off. Do that. Take a look, and we're going to look for 26. Scroll down to 26, and we can see that it is powered off. So it's completed. The next thing that I'd like to do is go ahead and look at a summary of just that one virtual machine versus looking at the entire group. Oop. So we didn't have to scroll through and look at all of them. Let's look at a specific one. Look at a summary. All right. So this is very specific to that one single virtual machine, 26. And again, we can still see that it's powered off. But just wanted to show you that there's no need to call all of the virtual machines. We can certainly point it to just virtual machine 26, which was the load balancer. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and power it back on. Why not? As you can see right here, VM power on, right, as part of the op name, and then the parameter again is 26 for that specific virtual machine. Send that in there, and we can see that we sent it in. And just for the sake of seeing what's happening here from the GUI, we'll just take one more look at the GUI. So you can see that it's powering on from the GUI. And if we migrate back into our EC2 instances, we can see that we're in the process of bringing it online. So it'll take a few more minutes and this will change. Some other options that we have for a virtual machine is we could reboot a virtual machine. We could also terminate a virtual machine. Keep in mind, when you terminate a virtual machine, it permanently deletes it from AWS or from another cloud provider. This is deleting the virtual machine in the cloud, which is a handy option in order to prevent accruing charges when we no longer need a virtual machine and we can decommission it from the cloud provider. All right, so load balancer is up and running according to EC2 as well. I'm going to show you the status logs, the service request logs as well. That's another way of identifying the status without needing to go to the portal. I just wanted to give you some perspective from both the provider cloud and from the Intercloud Fabric Director GUI. Now we're going to take a look at the catalogs. Again, catalogs are for users, so that way we can use them to make it easy to obtain resources and to spin up brand new virtual machines, or to migrate an existing virtual machine from the private cloud to the public cloud, and from the public cloud back to the private cloud, or from the public cloud to the private cloud to another public cloud provider in any of those scenarios. So what we want to do is see what we have available to us in terms of catalogs. So we'll go ahead and paste this one in here. As you can see, this is get all catalogs. Once we know the names of the catalogs, we can look at a specific catalog as well, much like we did with the virtual machines in the virtual data centers. All right, so what do we have here? We have a LAMP stack, AWS LAMP stack, and we also have an app server. So that's what we're going to look at, is creating a brand new app server without needing to go to the GUI. We're going to call the catalog from an API. So if we come back here, we'll take a look at the parameters that we need in order to do that. All right. All right, so this one is a little more detailed than the others with parameters. In order to configure this, we need several parameters, or actually two at a minimum. Okay, so we have parameter 0 is the app server, which is the name of the catalog. Now we may not know this name initially, so that's why we would want to look at the catalog, and we would annotate that, take notes from what we saw in the previous command. And then the other thing is we need to know the name of the virtual data center, right? So we looked at that command earlier as well. So we'll recap here real quick. So for in terms of the catalog, let's go ahead and look at that quickly. All right. So this is the one that we want. We would want to annotate this app server. Copy that one. And then we would also want to take a look at the virtual data center right here. The virtual data center of interest would be AWS app. So we would copy that parameter. Okay. Okay. Send it off. Now we have what we call a service result, which is a part of an identifier 84 that maps to the service request, so that we can locate this particular service request in the status, either using the Intercloud Fabric Director GUI, or we can call on the status by using this identifier. Cancel that request and go ahead and send a new request. All right, so this will give us a little bit of detail here. We can see that it's in progress, 84, right? And once it's complete, we could actually go back and look at the more detailed verbose response. But for now, we can see that it is running, and we'll take a look at this here in a few minutes to see where it stands. Actually, let's take a look at it in EC2 while we're waiting. All right, so app server 84. Okay. Now, although it does say running in EC2 environment, sometimes it's not complete, in that we're still installing the driver to create that VPN in Amazon, because it's an AMI image that we've uploaded previously, but we need to install that driver and connect that VPN. And that's probably where it's at this point, and I might have taken too long. It doesn't take a whole that much time when we're bringing up a brand new virtual machine. But let's see if we caught it. Oh, it's actually completed. Yeah, so by the time that I was talking, we go here, and we can see all of the detailed tasks right there. Oh, space. Got me again. Get rid of that space. Oh, we got more space. All right, so we'll go ahead and check it out. All right, sometimes we need to change the there we go. If for some reason some of these parameters require quotes, double quotes versus single quotes. Okay, make sure there's no spaces and so on. So this has went in to terminate, and we can prove that out. We can see that it's shutting down here in EC2. So we spun up a new virtual machine and we cleaned it up a bit. And I'm going to list it again. All VMs. You can see that it's still terminating. This is all VMs. This is a VM summary. Let's take a look at just the one VM. Okay. Single VM. All right. And in this case, we're going to have a parameter of 65. Let's get that in there. We might have to change this to quotes too. Let's go back into here. Boom. Make sure this doesn't have spaces, which it does. Get rid of any spaces. Send this in. If it doesn't work, we'll go ahead and, yeah, it's taking a second. Go ahead and take care of this. Quotes. There we go. So for just 65, we can see that remote service exception number 65. I think we have an error because it's probably terminated, so it has deleted 65. So we'll go ahead and look at the general view of all VMs, and I think that that's what we'll see, is that it doesn't exist anymore. Towards the bottom, yeah, we end with 62. We no longer have a 65. Okay, well, that concludes video 6, demo 4 regarding API and Intercloud Fabric Director as part of the Intercloud Fabric Business Edition. I look forward to the next demo where I think we're going to take a look at Docker for managing micro infrastructures and containers, and how we would implement that currently on top of Intercloud Fabric, as well as take a look at some of the other DevOps tool sets, one of those being Ansible, And then from there, I'll probably transition into Prime Service Catalog integration into Intercloud Fabric. And I'm brainstorming some other topics, so stay tuned. And perhaps we'll have a few more interesting demos now that we have achieved more of the advanced status in terms of the applications that we're testing on top of Intercloud Fabric. So thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.